Chad Daybell, he is such a Casper milquetoast. He is taller gentleman, always kind of a smile on his face, and he just looks a little bit bland, maybe boring. He was born in Utah on August 11th of 1968, and then he grew up in Utah and graduated from Springville High School, just an average, normal existence. He then attended Brigham Young University and studied communication, a very great school. And he and his brothers were actually profiled by the local news in 1992 because this is an interesting job that they all had. They were digging graves in the cemetery in Springville. That was the job he and his brothers have. And then he was a caretaker of the cemetery. And that was around the Halloween holiday that there was a write-up about his role as the caretaker of the cemetery. And here's something that he said during that interview. He said, sad times are always when you have to bury babies. That's always a poignant moment. Interesting quote, foreshadowing or not. Now, Springfield employment records indicate that Chad worked, and he worked in the city cemetery for some time and then resigned, and the whole family moved to Idaho. So in 2015, they moved to Idaho. And again, communications was his major, and he wrote in college, and he published a book about his cemetery experiences. He called it 1 Foot in the Grave. He also wrote personal memoirs that are still for sale today, including what he said were his near-death experiences. Next, he turned to his religious audience. He wrote a series of books about the end of times, and he was a prominent enough writer and podcaster that he was actually touted as one of 15 amazing speakers at a 2-day conference that he keynoted in St. George. Now, as of this time, his self-published titles are, again, still available for sale on Amazon. So let's go back to college, because while he was at Brigham Young University, he married Tammy Daybell. They got married in a temple in 1990, and then they stayed and lived in Utah for most of their marriage. They founded a book company in 2004, self-published a number of his books, and together they were married 28 years, and they had 5 children. So by all accounts, it was a very average, normal life for a married couple, 5 kids after they got married. He's writing books. But this somewhat boring-looking average father of 5 would soon turn to murder. Lust. Lust is defined as a very strong sexual desire, a strong craving for sex. This is the why behind the crimes of Chad Daybell, his motive. I'm Ashley Wilcott. I am a TV anchor. I'm a former judge and trial lawyer, and I have covered and been involved with many, many cases in all of those roles. And I will tell you, almost every case that I have seen intersects with one of the deadly sins: pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, and sloth. The opposite of the 7 heavenly virtues. Temptations that, taken too far, turn deadly. The motive. This week, we break down the case of Chad Daybell and how the deadly sin of lust ruined this steady Eddie. Let's get into it. This is the Deadly 7. Chad Daybell married Lori Vallow in Hawaii less than 3 weeks after his wife, Tammy Daybell, the wife that he had 5 children with, after she died. And just 7 months after he married Lori Vallow, on June 9th of 2020, the remains of two of Lori Vallow's children, JJ and Tylee, were found buried in Chad's backyard, and he was arrested for murder. Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell were actually having an affair when both of their spouses died unexpectedly, according to the investigators. Vallow's husband, Charles, that's Lori Vallow's husband, Charles, was shot to death by her brother, Alex Cox, in Arizona in July of 2019. Her brother said it was self-defense. He was never charged. And Charles had filed for divorce at that time, but they weren't yet divorced. And then after her husband, who had filed for divorce, was killed, she was having this affair with Chad Daybell. She immediately picked up her kids, JJ and Tylee, and her brother, and they moved to eastern Idaho to be closer to Chad Daybell. Again, Chad Daybell, still married at that time to Tammy, his wife, and he was a self-published writer of doomsday-focused fiction that was loosely based on Mormon teachings. So again, October of 2019, his wife, Tammy Daybell, dies. Now, Chad initially told the police that she was battling an illness, that she started coughing in her sleep, that she fell out of the bed and died. But an autopsy later determined that she actually died of asphyxiation. Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow married weeks after her death, which surprised all of the family members of Chad Daybell. After that, 9 months later, they go to Hawaii. They have this great wedding. Chad Daybell's kind of a little bit goofy looking in a lot of the pictures. Again, a Casper milquetoast looking guy standing there kind of grinning, not showing any teeth, while Lori Vallow is tan and white smile, and both of them just look so happy in Hawaii while they're getting married 3 weeks after their spouses are dead. And 9 months after that wedding in Hawaii, the children who had gone missing, JJ and Tylee, are found on his property in eastern Idaho. The prosecutors say that Alex Cox, Lori's brother, conspired with Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow in all three deaths of Tylee, JJ, and Tammy, Chad's wife. Now, Alex Cox, the brother, he died of natural causes. You know, they even investigated that and said, yes, it was natural causes. So he was never charged with any of these crimes. He's deceased. So you have two people left, Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow. Prosecutors during the trial of Chad Daybell, they called dozens of witnesses to bolster their claims that Chad was in fact involved in conspiracy to kill the two children and Tammy Daybell. And the prosecutor's theory of the case was that both Chad and Lori wanted to get rid of any obstacles to their relationship. Prosecutors say that Chad justified the killings by creating a belief system that people could be possessed by evil spirits and turned into zombies, and that the only way to save that zombie's possessed soul was for the possessed body to die. Fremont County Prosecutor Lindsay Blake said Daybell styled himself a leader of what he called the Church of the Firstborn, and that he told others and Vallow that he, Chad Daybell, could determine if someone had become a quote-unquote zombie. Daybell also claimed to be able to determine how close a person was to death by reading what he called their death percentage. And this was an argument that Blake made during the closing arguments of the murder charges against Chad Daybell. They would be labeled as dark by Chad Daybell. Their death percentage would drop, and then they would have to die. That was part of the closing argument. Blake also said that Daybell manipulated Lori Vallow and her brother Alex Cox into helping with the plan, at times bestowing spiritual blessings on Cox and warning Lori Vallow that the angels were angry because she was at times ignoring him. There were texts between Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow that, when read aloud during the course of this trial, made it sound like a middle school crush and a passion and a lustfulness by Chad Daybell that was very immature, very physical, very sexual. Daybell's defense attorney, John Pryor, rejected all these descriptions of Chad Daybell's beliefs that were being put forward by the prosecution. His attorney described Daybell as a traditional member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a deeply religious man who talked about his spiritual beliefs every time, every chance that he could. And the defense attorney Pryor said that police looked only for things that they could use against Daybell rather than the actual facts of the case. The defense's position was that Alex Cox committed the crimes and that Cox then tried to frame Daybell by burying the dead children in Daybell's yard. All 5 of Chad Daybell's children have publicly come to his defense. They're all adults, and they all told 48 Hours that they are convinced of the innocence of their father, Chad Daybell. They believe that the way JJ and Tylee were found buried in a shallow grave on the property suggests, though, because it was a shallow grave, that their father was not involved. Because remember, he's a former grave digger. And they all say he would have been smart enough not to bury the bodies on his own property. Here's a quote from Emma Murray, his daughter. He was framed. This is his property. If there's bodies buried there, it would be attributed to him. She blamed Lori and Alex Cox, whose GPS put him on the property the day that the prosecutors believed that Tylee was buried there. Here's what else she had to say. I think it's pretty clear it was Lori and Alex. Alex came and left for periods of time, and we don't know exactly what he was doing. Alex and her brother Garth Daybell testified during the trial for the murders on their father's behalf. On June 1st of 2024, Chad Daybell had been convicted for the murder of his wife Tammy and conspiracy to commit murder of JJ and Tylee. And on June 1st, he was sentenced to death on the recommendation of the jury that had convicted him in the first place. Chad Daybell on death row for these murders. I want to welcome our guest today, Michelle Thomas, a Washington, D.C. trial attorney and domestic attorney, a legal analyst. You've been on with me lots, Michelle, and I always love your insight, your expertise, and I value everything you bring to the table today. I want to comment on this Chad Daybell. What a patsy. That's my opinion. Every picture I've seen, I watched the entire trial that he went through, and I just feel like he was kind of a dumb middle schooler with a crazy crush and was lustful after Lori. There were text messages, and he just sounded so immature to me, but that clearly I think lust is what drove him to be involved with the murders. He was convicted of the murder of Tammy, his wife, as well as conspiracy to commit murder of JJ and Tylee. And, to me, it's just that old story of, oh, look who I got. And he's just, I've described him as a Casper milquetoast kind of a looking guy. And then you've got little tiny petite, gorgeous knockout Lori. And even though she may have some screws loose, I do think that he got caught up in a relationship with her. So let's start there and tell me your thoughts.
Yeah, well, first of all, Judge Ashley, thank you so much for having me. You're amazing, and I always have enjoyed being on with you on other shows. And so, yeah, this Chad Daybell, Lori Vallow trial is one for the books. And let me tell you, like, as you said, I'm a divorce lawyer and trial lawyer in the DC area. This is simply a man who wanted to cheat on his wife. He met this blonde bombshell and was like, you know what? I want her. And then he concocted this whole like religious theory and like they were drawn together spiritually to justify cheating on his wife. And when you juxtapose, and this is really, I don't want to be insensitive here, Judge Ashley, but when you juxtapose the two photos of his wife, and it's such a tragic death that she suffered, and I'm so sorry for all of their loss. With Lori, he I think you can see that he simply was like, this woman's hot. I want her. And there you have it. And then this whole storyline exploded. And, it's like a little tiny lie that just mounted and mounted. And before you knew it, they were in this entire scheme to knock everybody off so they could be together.
I agree with you. And I just have to echo I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I have to echo what you just said, Michelle, because so many people I know have looked, to your point, at the pictures and said, Chad's thinking, I can't believe I caught her. I can't believe Lori likes me. And so he would do whatever it took to keep her around and do her bidding. I definitely see it as he was doing her bidding to have that affair. But I will say it's a divisive case, as you well know. And so there are people that say, no, 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 no. She is the manipulative one. I believe she was very prideful, egotistical, narcissistic, and even his kids say it was her, not him, and she manipulated him. What do you think?
So all of that is true. I think you hit the nail right on the head with respect to who this Lori person is. She's manipulative. Was probably the brains behind it, because I think I saw the other day someone said, that men always get caught cheating because they're so simple. Like they're just so just basic. And so she was probably the mastermind behind it, sort of the puppet master pulling the strings behind it. But it takes two to tango. And this was a grown man. He knew he had taken vows. And it seems like they had a pretty normal family up until this whole monstrosity unfolded. And so he knew better, and he could have walked away at any point in time and said, you know what, or divorced his wife. And I always tell people, we've done these other true crime shows, and it's like, divorce is an option. You don't have to kill the person. So, but I think that he was definitely a player in this. He's certainly not without fault in this whole thing, though I do agree that Lori was probably the mastermind behind that whole scheme.
Yeah, so let's go down that rabbit hole you just mentioned. Why not just get a divorce? He's now been convicted for the murder of Tammy, and the circumstances around that were weird. He said she was sick, she was coughing, that she fell out of bed, that she died. But there were odd things like how her body was, etc., that made them start questioning. And then we find out it was asphyxiation that killed her. So why, in your experience, you handle divorces? How does it go? And to me, this is the thing about deadly sins, the temptation, the motive, that people go down a path that becomes very evil and committing crimes. Why not just get divorced? He easily could have gotten divorced, gotten Tammy out of the way. The kids were all adults. They were on their own anyway, and moved to Lori. Why go to killing her?
Yeah, yeah. Well, again, we're talking about lust here, and I'm glad you mentioned the evil component, because there is, right, this spiritual evil dynamic here, right? Particularly when you're talking about the seven deadly sins. And so lust makes people do things that are completely inappropriate, completely outside of the bounds of a reasonable person's bandwidth. And so here we are, someone who's driven by lust. There are these evil spirits and dynamics that are sort of festering here and infiltrating. And the two of them together began to believe that they could outsmart everyone, that they were the smartest people in the room, that they can beat this, they can win, which is why they were essentially captured in Hawaii on a beach, I guess, or at the pool vacationing. They began to believe the lies. And when you talk about evil spirits, there's often that's tied to lying, a lot of lies and deception, and they began to believe it. And when you have one person feeding you, such as Lori, telling him possibly, we can do this, we can get away with it, you begin to believe it, and you lose sight and with that reality, that no, you can't get away with it. So, I think there's that component that's part of it, and then it's just sort of human nature in terms of ego and him becoming so, the two of them together becoming so egotistical that they thought they could outsmart everyone.
Yep.
So
And
and
it
then you have this tragic ending.
and it turns evil. You're right. It turns evil. So Michael Ayala and I were reading the texts back and forth, and I was Lori and he
Yeah,
was Chad.
I
And I
remember
will
that.
never forget. I don't know if you remember it or not, but the
Yeah.
thing that stuck out to me as I was reading them, not always like, I can't wait till we'll be together again, things like that. So, not awful words, but every one of them, I thought it was so cringy because it would be kissy face emoji, kissy face emoji, kissy face emoji. And then another would be heart, 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 heart. It was so, to me, immature, childish. You wouldn't know their ages. I'm not saying you can't be fun and fun-loving and use lots of emojis. That's not my point. But here they are now convicted of two kids dead, Tammy dead, and yet this is the way they're talking to each other. I think it speaks volumes about their lack of capacity to be remorseful, to understand what they've done, to understand they did something that was wrong. They both still assert their innocence. And Michelle, I also want to bring back up that all 5 of Chad's adult children support him. And here's what his daughter, Emma Murray, said. He was framed. This is his property. If there's bodies buried here, it would be attributed to him. And they all believe that he's innocent. They also talk about his past as a gravedigger, which is true. He was a gravedigger. And that, number one, he wouldn't have done a shallow grave for each of the kids. And number two, he would have been smart enough not to bury the bodies on his own property.
Well, that was always the head scratcher, right? In this whole case, is
Mhm.
that first of all, his profession, he's a professional grave digger. And so to bury the bodies in your own backyard, I mean, that could be the first place people look. It made no sense that they wouldn't have tried to at least get rid of the bodies elsewhere. But nonetheless, again, these are people who were so detached from reality, who were so just emboldened in what they believed. And remember, a couple of people had passed in this scenario here. And so they may have felt like, well, maybe they got away with one, death or being involved in one capacity. And then you begin to think you can continue to escape the law and any kind of repercussions. So, it doesn't make sense. We're trying to make sense of something that doesn't make any sense. But regarding the children, you have to remember too that sometimes there's mind control involved, there's manipulation involved, and also kids may not want to believe that their parents are capable of killing the other parent, their spouse. And so there are a whole lot of dynamics here going on, some psychological, some spiritual, evil. So there was a lot affecting this ultimate decision here, and that they're still professing their innocence. When we heard, and just not to go too far into Lori, but when we heard Lori's sort of closing statement, what she was saying in the courtroom was so far-fetched. I mean, it had no reason to it. So we can't really make sense of it, I think, at this point. It's hard to.
Yeah, I would agree. And we can't ever know why it happened or why they did it. But I think looking at that motive, it tells us a lot. And talking about the kids, I was thinking about that too. I said, okay, if I'm an adult and God forbid I was in this circumstance, my parents were married for almost 60 years, would I have thought that one was capable of killing the other? And I will tell you no, because there was no indication, there was no violence. And from all accounts, there was none of that between Chad and Tammy. They kind of had separate lives, and the kids said they were doing separate things, but they were living under the same roof. So I see why, as an adult child, I might think, yeah, I can't imagine that he or she did this. So they stand by him. But I also want to look back, because I think this goes directly to what you were talking about and the tumble down the hill, so to speak, from lust to committing an evil crime. When he was talking to a reporter way back in 2001, he was interviewed because of his job digging graves at the Springville Cemetery. He and his brothers all had these jobs. And when he was interviewed, here was his quote: "Sad times are always when you have to bury babies." So he says that back in 2001.
Yeah.
He goes after Lori. I think he's caught up in the sex and the beauty and, ooh, look who I got.
Uh-huh.
And then he ends up involved and convicted of conspiracy to commit murder of 2 babies. They were 7 and 16. Those are babies, Michelle.
Yeah. Yeah. They are children, and it's inconceivable. And, you know, the comment, I mean, that's an odd comment, right? Like, the worst part is when you have to bury babies. I mean, okay. And so we're just dealing with these sort of depraved minds. Then he wrote this novel that was sort of loosely based on, it seems like, their love story. And so, Chad did. And so there's sort of a pattern here where these kinds of thoughts apparently infiltrated his mind. And so, to your earlier point, just Ashley, whether Lori was the mastermind and whether he was just sort of the dumb puppet, I don't know. I mean, it's possible that he was also part of concocting this plot, because these are the kinds of things he thought about. And this, I hope this isn't inappropriate, but Chad does not present as someone who got a lot of attention from women and
Oh, I
all of
agree.
that. So
Even if
the
it's
fact,
inappropriate, I completely agree with that statement from everything you read, hear, and see
yeah,
about Chad Daybell.
yeah, and so it's just like his mind was blown, to your point about having the opportunity to be with her, and so there were just no bounds and nothing stopping him from doing whatever it took to get with this blonde alleged bombshell type woman, and that included getting rid of children or whoever he had to that stood in the way. Then again, that's the lust driving that conduct that stood in the way between himself and the woman of his dreams. And I think that's what we saw.
And you do have to wonder if it's foreshadowing, because that was a weird
Sure.
statement to me to make too. And it just feels all over a long period of time, it just feels all too related, even though it seemingly isn't. There's a lot of creepy in this whole
Very
story.
creepy.
Anytime you have the brutal murder of a 16-year-old and a 7-year-old, there's going to be creep. But this one, especially true. Do you think, I want to get your opinion, Alex Cox, we know, is the brother of Lori Vallow. He is the one that shot, and he said it was self-defense, but shot her 4th husband, Charles, and killed him, never charged. And then you pointed out there were other deaths. He died of natural causes. I don't believe that. I know they looked into it and said, no, it was natural causes. That's the second person in Lori's life that died of natural causes, and I don't buy it. But B, he wasn't charged with anything at the time of his death. Do you believe that he was intimately involved in planning or committing Tylee and JJ's murders?
So I have thought about this person, Alex, and the fact that he suffered an untimely, unexpected death, and that raises certainly an eyebrow. Uh, I actually think that he probably was involved, and if he didn't actually commit the crimes, that he knew more than what Chad and Lori wanted him to know. And so, quite frankly, I don't put it past Chad and Lori to have been involved somehow with his demise. If you're willing to get rid of children, you're certainly willing to get rid of a brother or anyone else. And so that piece of the puzzle has always bothered me in terms of what role he played, how he ultimately ended up dead, and what role Lori and Chad had to do with that. So it raises a really great point and question. And, will we ever know the truth? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. So I asked the same question of Chad and Lori, because we don't know who physically killed the kids, who actually cut up the body of Tylee. JJ suffocated with a plastic bag over his head. Do you, especially given your excellent trial work in domestic cases, could it be possible from your perspective that either a mother, Lori, or her boyfriend, who's so lustful after her, Chad, could have been the ones to physically do this? Are either of them capable of it, do you think?
From what we've seen, I think Lori is absolutely capable of it. And,
Oh.
one point that stands out is I believe that was it both or one of them were her adopted children, were her
JJ was adopted. That's a
they,
good point. By her and one of her other husbands, but JJ was adopted.
yes. And so what I have seen, certainly as a family law practitioner and working with blended families and that dynamic, is that there is oftentimes a difference between how the parent who's raising the child is connected and feels about the child versus the biological parent. There shouldn't be any differences or distinctions made, but there often is. And so to the extent that there was any kind of disconnect there, and then we've seen the kind of depraved mind she has from her trial, yes, I think she's absolutely capable. I don't know how to explain the daughter, demise, but there's nothing much that I would put past Lori. Now, Chad, people, when they're driven to be with their a mistress or whomever, there are often boundaries. So if you want, at the point that you want to bring, let's say, this other person into a divorce or whatever, they may say, hey, I'm willing to go, but so far I'm not going to lie for you. There are certain things I'm just not going to
Right.
do for this other person. And so it is odd to me that Chad would have been so caught up, which is, again, I think where this lust comes in, because that's an even stronger force, evil force, than your typical, I just want to have a good time with this other person. So when you factor in the lust component, it's possible, but generally third parties or boyfriends, significant others are like, hey, that's too far. I'm willing
Yeah.
to do a lot for you, but I'm not willing to kill children for you. So
Right. Right. You are right. People have boundaries. They don't go to that demented place that happened in this case. It's interesting you say when adopted children, sometimes they're treated differently in the cases you see. I've done child abuse and neglect cases my entire career, and it's typical that there's a target child in abuse and neglect cases, especially physical abuse cases. So you may have 8 children in the home, and there's one that is always the one being abused. I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, so I'm not going to delve into the whys, but we see it to be true. And you do wonder how much of that comes into this case, given the very different manners in which JJ was killed, suffocated, body all laying in his pajamas, versus we know Tylee, her body was cut into pieces. So you do wonder those things. Again, we may never know.
yeah.
The other part of this case is, looking at it, let me reframe this question because it's an important one. We know Lori Vallow Daybell did not face the death penalty. And there were lots of different reasons for that, but the decision was made by the state not to pursue it against her. She's convicted for killing both kids, conspiracy to commit murder against Tammy. Meanwhile, Chad is convicted of murdering Tammy and conspiracy to commit murder of the other two, and he faced the death penalty. The same jury that convicted him did recommend the death penalty, and the judge sentenced him to death. How does it feel to you to see a case like this when I think they're both equally culpable? He's on death row, she's not.
Yeah. And given the fact that we don't know, to your point earlier, who physically committed the murders, it does seem like there's some level of, disconnect or unfairness there. But that being said, I don't know that we can really blame the system for this, because in Lori's case, it was due to, I understand, discovery infractions by the state that
True.
removed the possibility of death as a sentence for Lori. And so we really
That's right.
have to, if we're going to look at anybody, it's looking at the state. And as you know, I mean, we're trial lawyers, the discovery process, particularly in a murder case, you have to dot all of your I's, cross all of your T's, and turn over the evidence, turn over any possible evidence against the defendant, so that defense counsel can be fully prepared. So, I would say it's unfortunate that the death penalty was removed due to discovery reasons and those kinds of technicalities. But, in this case, he was involved. I mean, he was complicit, and we don't know exactly which role he played. but it appears as though justice was served.
Yeah, I would agree with that. My last thoughts, I think I would say to anyone and everyone listening, be careful. Be careful, not just of your own lust and doing things because you can't say no to someone you have a chemistry with, but also be aware of another person, because if they're that way with you, what are they willing to do? What boundary might they cross, even if you don't want them to? So it's just something to always keep in the back of your mind. The lust motive that I believe is the motive, the why that Chad Daybell committed these heinous crimes. Michelle, I would welcome any last thoughts.
That's a great point, Judge Ashley, and it's a slippery slope. It may have started out as a lie and it ended up with murder. And so you have to be mindful of the company you keep, because there were outside influences and forces here most likely that affected Chad Daybell's outcome. And now look, now he's facing the death penalty as a result of it. So be careful and ask yourself, is it really worth it?
Yeah.
So
Great advice. Thank you so much, Michelle Thomas. I love it.
thank you for having me.